Alright guys, so we're going to watch this white guy trying to do some push-ups. Clearly he's trying to show off in the gym, but I think he's going to struggle a little bit by the looks of him. So let's watch him, and what he's really going to be talking about is the economy of cellular respiration and the various processes whereby the body creates energy in the form of ATP. His arms moved, his shoulders moved, his heart pumped a little faster to get blood to those working muscles. So as he's moving back and forth, he's saying that it's very difficult work to figure it out, but if you do it right, it'll come with great payoffs, and that's what we're hoping to get out of this today. It all starts with the wonderful molecule of ATP, and that's where we're going to be focusing. Pay attention, guys. This is important. ATP, ATP, ATP. Oh, yes. So the way that we and our cells get energy and other animal cells get energy is through a process called cellular respiration. We're going to be talking about specifically how we get energy out of food, mostly glucose, since that's what most of the food that we consume becomes anyway. This is a chemical formula for one molecule of glucose, and in order to turn that into energy for us, we're going to need to add some oxygen, specifically 6 of them, and that's what we're going to use for cellular respiration. We're going to take it and make 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water, and then the energy that we're going to use to do whatever it is that we want to do. But our bodies just can't use that energy. We have to turn it to a very specific molecule to store that energy. That's ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So you've heard me talk about this before, and people often refer to ATP as the currency of biological energy. So think of it like an American dollar. You can't just walk into a store in the United States and come up with a bunch of yen or pesos or whatever and expect them to sell you something. Even though a yen or peso are money, that's not the right kind of money. You have to use the right currency, and that would be what ATP is for cells. Our cells need adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, to do all kinds of stuff, including growth. And you guys may remember back when we talked about transport, moving things in and out of the cell. If you have any questions about active transport, you need to look back at that. So before we look at how ATP is put together, let's look at how cells can cash in on that energy that's stored inside. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is made up of the nitrogenous base adenine, a sugar called ribose, and 3 phosphates that are attached to it. You need to know about the 3 phosphate groups, and they are very, very uncomfortable sitting next to each other in a row, like 3 kids on a bus who hate each other, all sharing the same seat. So because these groups hate each other so much, it's very easy for ATP to lose one of the phosphates, and therefore releasing some of that energy as it becomes ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, because it has 2. So during this reaction, when the third jerk kid is kicked off the seat, energy is released. And since there are a lot of water molecules going around, one of the OH groups, the hydroxyl group, will then take that place, and everybody is much happier. So remember that when you use water to break down a compound, it's called hydrolysis. Hydro for water and lysis for separate. So now that you see how ATP is spent, let's look at how it's minted or made by cellular respiration. It all starts with oxygen and glucose. In fact, the textbooks, some textbooks would say that 1 molecule of glucose will make a little bit of heat and up to 38 molecules of ATP. But that number is not really real. It's more like a base case scenario. In reality, it's more like 29 or 30 ATP, but whatever, it's close enough. So cellular respiration is not something that happens all at once. Glucose is converted to ATP through a process. 3 cycles: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And they're usually described as one coming after the other, but in reality in the cell it's all happening really at once. Let's start with the first step, which is glycolysis, or the breaking down of the glucose. So we start with glucose, which we know is a sugar because it has an O's at the end of it. And glycolysis is just a breaking down of that glucose, that 6-carbon ring, into 2 3-carbon acids called pyruvic acids. In this particular video, we're not going to talk about all the steps for glycolysis because it would take like an hour, and it would have big words like phosphoglucoisomerase, which is one of the enzymes, so we're going to skip that for now. But you have to think of it this way. If you're going to make some money, you have to spend some money to make it. So glycolysis needs or requires 2 ATPs in order to gain or make at the net profit of 4 ATPs. So aside from the 4 ATPs, it results in 2 pyruvates and 2 super energy rich NADHs. So these are the love children of NAD+, which is a B vitamin with energized electrons and a hydrogen to create the storehouses which will have the energy that will later be used to make ATP. So let's keep track of all the stuff we made so far. So far we have 2 ATP and 2 NADH, which will be used to make more ATP later. Now let's look at oxygen right now. Oxygen is necessary for the overall process, but not every stage needs oxygen. Glycolysis, for example, does not require oxygen, therefore it's called anaerobic process. So in the absence of oxygen, the pyruvates that are made in glycolysis will get rerouted to a process called fermentation. If there's no oxygen in the cell, it would need more of that NAD+ to keep the glycolysis going, but it will have some weird side effects and interesting molecules will be formed. For example, in some yeast, the product of fermentation is ethyl alcohol, which would be the same thing as the alcohol that people drink. Lucky for us as humans, we don't have that problem. Our muscles, when they lack oxygen, they don't make alcohol. Otherwise, working out would be very interesting. So instead of ethyl alcohol, what our muscles do when they don't have oxygen, they make lactic acid, which burns. I'm sure you felt that before. And it's also what makes you feel sore after the workout. So let's say that your muscles use all the oxygen they had, and they had to kick over to anaerobic respiration to get all the energy they need to move. So you have all this lactic acid building up on the tissues, and you can feel it burn. Oh! So let's go back to the score. We have 2 ATP through glycolysis, and then we know that the other 37 you're going to have to deal with oxygen. That's the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, because they're both aerobic, so they need oxygen, they need air in order to make it work. We find ourselves in the next step, which of course after glycolysis is the Krebs cycle. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm where things are just hanging out in the cell, but the Krebs cycle actually happens inside the membrane, the mitochondria, which is considered for us the powerhouse. So the Krebs cycle takes the end products of glycolysis, those pyruvate molecules, and reworks them to make another 2 ATP per glucose molecule plus some energy in a couple of different forms. And this is how. First off, pyruvates are oxidized. Basically means it's just combined with oxygen. One of the carbon molecules gets bonded with oxygen and leaves the cell as CO2. So what's left is a 2-carbon compound called acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA. Then another AD comes along, picks up a hydrogen and becomes NADH. Or 2 pyruvates make another 2 molecules of NADH to be used later. And like with everything else in biology, enzymes are the proteins that bring everything together and make it happen. It's very important here again for glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. And they bring everything together just the right way. For example, phosphate and ATP to make ATPs from each pyruvate. Enzymes will also join the pyruvate in a 4-carbon molecule, oxaloacetic acid. And then they come together to form a 6-carbon molecule called citric acid. It's the stuff that's in orange juice. So this is fun, especially when my kids are in the background yelling. But here's another fun fact. The Krebs cycle is sometimes called the citric acid cycle because of this byproduct. But it is usually given to the man who figured it all out. His name was Hans Krebs, and he was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon who fled Nazi Germany to teach biochemistry at Cambridge, where he discovered this crazy thing in 1937. And for being a genius, he was given the Nobel Prize of Medicine in 1950. Anyway, the citric acid gets oxidized a bunch of different ways, and then it goes back to the oxaloacetic acid, which is what makes Krebs cycle into an actual cycle. And as the carbons get cleaved off, acetic acid that is left over, they make in CO2 or carbon dioxide, which is exhaled by the cell and eventually by you as you breathe out. You and I, as we live, we are exhaling the products of the Krebs cycle right now. Good work. And then we're going to have the scrawny guy once again doing some push-ups, using some energy and some ATPs. Now each time the carbon comes off of the citric acid, some energy is made, but it's not ATP. It's stored in a whole different kind of molecular package. And this is where we go back to NAD plus and its colleague FAD. NAD plus and FAD are chummy enzymes that are related to B vitamins, derivatives of niacin and riboflavin, which you might have seen in the vitamin aisle. These B vitamins are good at holding on to high energy electrons and keeping that energy until it can be used later on in the electron transport chain. And they're so good at it that they show up a lot in those vitamin packets. That NADs and FADs are like batteries. Pick up hydrogen and energize electrons from each pyruvate. Hydrogen turns them into NADH and FADH2. Each pyruvate yields 3 NADHs and 1 FADH, 2 per cycle. And since each glucose has been broken down into 2 pyruvates, that means that each glucose molecule can produce 6 NADHs and 2 FADHs too. And the main purpose of the Krebs cycle is to make those powerhouses for the next and final step, which is the electron transport chain. At this point, you're probably wondering, why aren't we making ATP? Let's make it happen, dude. So when it comes to ATPs, the electron transport chain is the real moneymaker. That's right, this is where it happens. So the ETC on an efficient cell can make a whopping 34 ATPs. So remember all those NADHs and FADHs that we made in the Krebs cycle? Well, their electrons is going to make the energy or provide the energy that we need. That will work as a pump along a chain of channel workers across the inner membrane of the mitochondria where the Krebs cycle occurs. These proteins will swap these electrons and send hydrogen protons from the inside of the mitochondria across to the inner membrane to the outer compound of the mitochondria. But once they're out, the protons want to get back in because of the concentration gradient. And nature always tends to seek a nice peaceful balance, so this is going against it, and it requires that energy to do it. And all those protons are allowed back in through a special protein called ATP synthase. And these protons are the mechanism that turns around to make ATP out of ADP and phosphate. So the electrons from the 10 NADHs that come out of the Krebs cycle are able to can make enough energy to squeeze 3 ATPs each. And we can't forget NFDHs. There's 2 of them, and they also make ATPs for a grand total of 38. And that's how animal cells the world over make ATP out of cellular respiration. So just to check, let's reset the counter and start again for a single glucose molecule from the beginning. We make 2 ATPs for each pyruvate during glycolysis. We made 2 during the Krebs cycle, and during the electron transport chain we made about 34, and that's just for one single glucose molecule. Imagine how much your body uses and makes every single day. Don't use it all in one place, guys. Now you can go back and use and review any part of this episode that you didn't quite get. Also notice this guy, as he's pumping out the machine, he's got no weights on it. He's just a scrawny dude. Anyway, I hope that makes it somewhat clearer, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
Bye, biology students. Study
hard.
hard.
What do you think, Isaac?
Hard.
You should study hard, right?